You are one of the biggest investors in the Web3 space. The way the revenue comes in and you put it back in the ecosystem to support the builders and developers to keep on growing the ecosystem. We have an OG, a legend in the Web3 space with us. Yat Siu, founder of Animoca brands and a keen investor in the Web3 space. Even the companies like Apple, Google, who are sitting with a lot of cash, are not doing that. That cash goes on with them.
Apple and Epic had this lawsuit. How many people came for Apple's defense and said, "Ooh, you know what, Epic, you guys are a little rough. It's okay to pay 30% because, Apple's the good guys"? Zero, okay? Because do you want to do business with someone where the value they generate is purely extractive? Or would you rather do business with someone knowing that when this business does well, it actually helps and furthers the ecosystem?
How do you do that? You worked hard, you built something, you got success, you got the money, but you're still stuck close to your values, to your tradition, to your ethos.
And I grew up in Austria. First perspective, as a Chinese person in Austria, I was very much a minority. My mom was an artist, she was a singer, and was often taken advantage of financially, also had an impact. And so that kind of shaped one form of thinking. But I think of ourselves as chaos engines, right? Meaning that humans have this incredible quality that is both creative and heavily destructive. Now, if you look historically, anytime, any society, any environment, winners take all approach, it usually ends in tears. And it doesn't necessarily end in tears only on the side of the ones who are losing or taken advantage of, because it turns out that the people who've been taken advantage of tend to have a revolution.
Hello everybody, my name is Kapil Dhiman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Quranium. Welcome to Quantum Minds podcast. And today we have an OG, a legend in the Web3 space with us. We are absolutely excited to interview Yat Siu, founder of Animoca brands and a keen investor in the Web3 space. Yad, welcome to Quantum Minds.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So Yad, like we discussed in this conversation today, I would really love to cover the journey of what led to Animoca becoming one of the biggest names, the biggest organizations in the Web3 space. I had the fortune of attending the Animoca Portfolio Day, where you presented the success of Animoca. Today, the top line of Animoca brands is over $300 million in revenue. You are one of the biggest investors in the Web3 space. The way the revenue comes in and you put it back in the ecosystem to support the builders and developers to keep on growing the ecosystem. That's really unheard of. Even the companies like Apple, Google, who are sitting with a lot of cash, are not doing that. That cash goes on with them. But you have stuck true to the ethos of Web3. You built a project which has become an example of what Web3 can deliver. And then the revenue that comes in, you're putting it back in the ecosystem. So first of all, would love to congratulate you on that and would love to share you. How did it happen? What is it? How has been the journey that led to this milestone success?
Okay. So, thank you for that. I would say that before I even maybe go into the business itself, I think a lot of, whether it's business leaders, founders, entrepreneurs, try to sort of infuse some of their philosophy or their influences that they've had, and whatever influences they've had in the past do shape the way that they sort of, do business decisions or life decisions for that matter, right? And I would say maybe for me, it really started in childhood, even before I started a business, because I started to sort of, when you look at Animoca brands, we look at things like, what are the problems in the world? What do we think is creating sort of this sort of mass inequity that we have? And on one hand, we're capitalists, but on the other hand, we can also see the problems that certain forms of capitalism can have. And that kind of came from my own experiences. When I was a child, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so probably a little older than maybe most of your audience, I'm guessing, but who knows. And I grew up in Austria. And so first perspective, as a Chinese person in Austria, I was very much a minority. And so that kind of shaped one form of thinking. And that thinking allowed me and was almost necessitated me to go in an early version of an online experience, which was CompuServe. And, there, it didn't matter, what race I was or ethnicity, what I looked like, or even how old I was. Back in the days, your CompuServe email address was a number, like 7506893, comma, whatever, right? It was literally just a number. So you were completely anonymous in a way. But you were only judged by your experiences and what you knew and what you could say. And so that provided opportunity, which eventually led to a job at Atari when I was basically a minor, right? So that's kind of one set of that experiences. The other one was I grew up in a time when Europe was still divided between East and West. So we had essentially the Iron Curtain. The eastern side of Europe was literally communist when we still had the USSR. My mom used to work at Komische Oper, which was on the eastern side of Berlin. So I would cross the border to see her, where I really saw what communism was like, right? I mean, like, rations, really 1984-ish. And then I would, live, however, on the western side, which was more socially democratic, which was a form of capitalism, but generally speaking, more socialist in thinking, welfare, support state, all that kind of stuff that we see in Europe still today in some form or fashion. And then because of work, I moved to the US and also to study. And in the US, I experienced capitalism pretty much, right? But actually at a time when I went there in the early 90s, America was in a recession. So I saw both capitalism, but also the problems related to that. But anyway, I was embraced with capitalism and where everyone was talking freely about money and, profits and how to make more money, right? That's something you don't really talk about in Europe. And then I went to Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong was capitalism overdrive, like literally Milton Friedman's wet dream. There was like no social security whatsoever. You would have 60, 70-year-old grandpas and grandmas, basically who basically pull up sort of, and take care of trash because you didn't have social security until much later. But where literally it was, capitalism in overdrive and all the benefits of that and also all the negatives of that. And so I think that kind of shaping sort of that environment sort of shaped my thinking about, what was happening in the world. But of course, I didn't know at the time that I would be doing Animoca brands or anything like that. It just kind of influenced me, right? The fact that my mom was an artist, she was a singer, and was often taken advantage of financially also had an impact, which is why we're very supportive of creators. Like the whole idea of supporting creators comes a little bit from that story of having experienced what sort of, I guess, hardships creators go through. And I've come much later down to the conclusion that it relates to the fact that in all of these cases, they didn't have financial literacy, as in they didn't understand money. And there was a concern and somewhat a fear of money and almost a, you would shun the conversation because it would seem rude, and this is kind of where, when I ended up being in Hong Kong, Hong Kong reminds me a lot of Dubai back in the day, not because of the buildings and so on, because of course things are more technologically modern and newer developments, but in terms of the mindset and spirit, Hong Kong, pre-handover, we're talking about, I moved to Hong Kong really in the early 90s, was sort of that center where all of the entrepreneurs and businesses would want to go to. It was very international. It was also part of a British colony, which meant that if you're a Commonwealth, you could just freely move there, right? And it would also had the highest ratios of Rolls Royces per capita, and probably the highest ratio of Rolexes and luxury hotels and sort of bling and like it's kind of similar to Dubai, right? And it's not to say that this is what Dubai is. It's to say that wealth, money, entrepreneurship, opportunity sort of attracted it in this area, and then new things started to develop. And I would argue that that was kind of a somewhat of a golden age of Hong Kong in terms of hope and opportunity and entrepreneurship. And we see a similar thing now happen in Dubai. And the things that these two places had in common was that there was a appreciation for entrepreneurship and innovation, but also a respect for money and wealth and an understanding that there was also risk involved. So there was a relationship with money that I would view as broadly healthy. Sure, you have greedy people and so on, right? But generally speaking, you wouldn't have to argue about, why you talk about investments. Or it was very common, for instance, or amongst your friends to talk about some deal or some opportunity. That doesn't happen in Europe, right? When you sit amongst most friends and you start talking about financial matters, it feels like a business transaction as opposed to something which you would build a relationship over. I think this kind of mindset carries over. And I feel like if we have more financial literacy and more knowledge, broadly speaking, around that space, then we will have better a better framework in the world, because then you don't get taken advantage of. Because money is ultimately the biggest form of power, I would say. And also, what I think people also didn't appreciate is that money has also not just become monetary and economic power; it's become social power. Right? If I have money, I can influence things. I can make more friends, whether they're real or not, is a question mark, because I have money. If I'm a politician that has access to money, I have more influence, right? The whole thing starts to sort of work with that. And if we don't understand how it works, and we don't understand what impact it has, then we can't really navigate in that world. And that's partially because the world has become more and more capitalist by design, but yet most people aren't capitalists per se, right? So we're still very much stuck for most people in the labor economy. I'm not saying that work isn't necessary or good. We are all laboring for our work, but we are all becoming really investors and capital owners, as in property owners of some form. And that's something, again, that most people didn't understand. Certainly my mom didn't understand that, and all of her peers and friends. You go to artists or musicians or craftsmen, they're thinking about their craft, but they're not thinking necessarily in forms of ownership and sort of capital value or capital appreciation. It's not something that we're taught, which is also the reason why they constantly get taken advantage of. It doesn't, whether you're a musician or whether you're, a driver, it doesn't really matter. You don't understand money, and therefore you get taken advantage of. So this was kind of some of the backdrop that shaped my thinking around sort of constructions of, what would be a fairer world, or what would be more just, and so on. Now, the whole Web3 journey came from sort of our experiences. And this is kind of interesting because just a few days ago, I think it was yesterday actually, Apple was just the judge basically put Apple in contempt of court because they had not opened up their payments platform and essentially opened up the Apple framework based on a judgment given to them in a lawsuit between sort of Apple and Epic. And so now Apple is finally forced to open up, certainly in places like the US. But our own experience with Apple in 2012, when we were one of the biggest game companies on mobile, of course, early days, Apple removed all our apps in 2012. And we had no idea who to talk to. They just did it. There was no court. There was nobody we could sort of, make a case. We just lost our entire business in 2012. As Animoca, having, sort of a large number of apps on the App Store. And this just sort of demonstrated the kind of power that we had now in the Web 2 world, where some dude somewhere, or woman, could decide our fate just on the click of a button. And fast forward a little bit later, when we discovered NFTs, basically with CryptoKitties, we were involved in that project. We found a way in which actually we would be able to actually have those kind of digital property rights and invest in our digital time and assets in a way that we actually could have full ownership over, and we didn't have to sort of depend on third parties. That was actually real digital freedom in a way. And from that, we could look at sort of what happens when you have that freedom and that certainty. That's a kind of digital property right. You can then start building capital value on top of it, and you can also trade and transact, and you can, from that experience, actually have true freedom. So we started off with gaming, but then as we started delving deeper, we came to realize this isn't just about gaming and gamers having ownership of stuff. That's cool and that's important, but it's actually much bigger and much wider, which then basically informed us of our thinking of, well, we need to build this ecosystem. Our mission is literally sort of delivering digital property rights to the world. And that meant we get into all areas, not just games, but education, deepen, AI, anything that can help basically advance this mission, which, is sort of broad and multifaceted. So I would say all these experiences helped shape. None of them were plans, right? It wasn't like, oh, this is what we want to do. It was things that we became sharper at our mission. And I would say, I think this is very common for businesses. Like when you start a business, you have this amorphous idea, or you have actually a very clear idea, but then because of the fact that maybe you didn't get the same customer adoption, or you're not making enough money or revenue, you kind of pivot and you shifted. Right. In our case, it was because Apple removed all apps. We had to sort of shift and pivot into a new direction. But it doesn't matter. New things come at you, and you basically change your businesses with the general mission to do something. And then as it goes, your options become more sharper as you become more experienced, and as your purpose becomes more clear. And then as time comes through, like if you look at the way that we communicated on Animoca brands 5 years ago, it's roughly in that direction, but not nearly as sharp as it is today, just because of the fact that we've become clearer on our mission, and we've also gone deeper. And that's the other thing about expertise. When you start going deeper in the subject and you sort of go down the rabbit hole, you just learn more. And actually, the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know stuff, right? And the more hungry you are for more knowledge. But that also means you gain more insights in a way. And that's kind of what we do all the time. And now I guess I go to, this is kind of long-winded, but I go to this part you opened up with saying, this new sort of, why do we invest so heavily into the ecosystem? So the thing for us was, how do we build sustainable businesses? It's a model of sustainability. And we think sustainability requires us to reinvest in that ecosystem. What I think is unsustainable in the business world and the world of capitalism today is this monopoly effect and this sort of zero-sum thinking, which is take all. Now, if you look historically, anytime any society, any environment has taken a take-all, winners-take-all approach, it usually ends in tears. And it doesn't necessarily end in tears only on the side of the ones who are losing or taken advantage of, because it turns out that the people who've been taken advantage of tend to have a revolution, right? And they go after the people who have the wealth and the money, right or wrong, and they rip it apart, and they do land redistribution, and they cause revolutions. And we have, thousands of years of history to demonstrate what happens when you have widening inequality. I mean, just don't take it from me, take it from history, right? And so what happens? What happens is that normally inequity is the big challenge. And how do you control that? So either you have a really, really strong government, almost sort of dictatorial, that basically oppresses you and makes sure that everything is peaceful. And that's what tends to happen. The ones who have power, as in they have money, tend to generally use oppression as a way to make sure things are managed. It wasn't that long ago that, I presume you're from India.
Yes.
Right? Well, I'm from Hong Kong, and we're both colonies of another type of oppressor nation. Yes. And in the beginning, you could say they came in and apparently wanted to do good things. And eventually, when we wanted more rights, then how did they maintain the peace? Oppression, military, violence, force, right? In none of these cases has violence and force really ever endured, possibly North Korea, right? And North Korea remains an exception and is a recent exception. I don't think anyone necessarily expects that North Korea will continue to survive. It's still a young country in the history of countries, right? Yeah. So let's see how that plays out. But in general, basically, if you don't manage sort of constructions of fairness and equity somehow in the world, then you tend to have these problems, and they basically rip society apart. And the other thing that we see in this capitalist model, which is understood, but I think is part of the defect, is that we've now come to a point where companies mostly just want to profit and generate all this profit only exclusively for themselves. Now, again, don't get me wrong. You want to create a model where you create value for shareholders, but that is sustainable. When you think about bottom lines, it's not only, some people talk about triple bottom lines, right? So the bottom line isn't only about how do you make more money. The bottom line can also include things. Basically, are you contributing back to society? Is it something that's net positive? And we see this in environmental businesses as well. Like you can basically conduct a good business, but maybe you can preserve the environment better. Maybe you are less polluting, or that's another form of bottom line, which is equally important. And it turns out that when you do these more sustainable activities, maybe you gain more customers, maybe you have more revenue as a result of that. And we see this. We as end users make choices to pay a little bit more money, the dolphin-free tuna, like for instance, or maybe things that don't affect the rainforest, right? Or we make decisions and we pay a small or sometimes big premium for something that we consider is important for the environment because it matters to us, right? And I see the same here now for large corporations where they have to reinvest back in the ecosystem. But what I find great is that because they invest in a capitalist manner, they're only backing projects that they hope will be profitable or successful, meaning that it's still value for shareholders, but enabling young entrepreneurs and founders to basically have more opportunity and grow the ecosystem. And I gave this example about Apple. If Apple took roughly 1% of their cash, which is really an interest rate rounding error for Apple, and turned it into a seed startup fund for the App Store, that would be about $3 billion. Okay? That would make it the biggest seed fund in the world. And Apple has no obligation to fund, anything on Google or whatever. They can say, if you're building on Apple and you're growing the Apple ecosystem, you can apply for this fund, right? Yeah. Now, what would happen? One, I think a lot more companies would love Apple. Two, a lot more people will be happy building on Apple because right now, you just don't make that kind of money. Three, I think people would have no problem paying 30%. Yeah. Because they know that the profits will go back into growing the ecosystem, which means more customers come in, which means they could make more business. I mean, that's what taxes do, right? The idea that you pay more taxes is supposed to give you better social services, better benefits, and you're happy to pay your taxes because you're getting some value for it that helps you make the business more sustainable. All of these companies are building ecosystems. They're not just building one or two products. They become basically nations of their own in a way, but they don't behave that way. Instead, they take all the money, extract out, and this capital sits mostly in Ireland for tax reasons in extremely unproductive ways, right? And it sucks the ecosystem dry. Nobody makes money on the App Store from a discovery standpoint. Only the big guys do. Small indie developers really, really struggle, right? And it's a perfect example. When Apple and Epic had this lawsuit,
Mhm.
how many people came for Apple's defense and said, "Oh, you know what, Epic, you guys are a little rough. It's okay to pay 30% because Apple's the good guys." Zero.
Yeah.
Okay. And why is that? Because they basically extracted so heavily that everyone said enough. But if they were an investor in the ecosystem or they brought back, it's not just about reducing fees. Then people would come to their defense and said, "Look, you're paying 30%, but you know what? I benefited, or I benefited, or I benefited." We see this effect in other countries around the world, like for instance, places like Finland, right, where people, have very high taxes, but they're very happy to pay them because they see the benefit that it provides. In fact, in some famous acquisitions, like I think when Tencent acquired Supercell, the creators of Clash Royale, the founders were like, "We're not leaving Finland, and you're not taking taxes somewhere else more efficient as part of the condition of the sale," because they recognized that money will also help build the local ecosystem, and because they cared about that, right? So there is a balance there to be had, and it's not against capitalism because you're reinvesting it in a better way, more productive than government. And that to me, I think, is a better model. And I feel like, we could be a demonstration of that. But I also think in Web3, it's more inherent in our nature, because in Web3, it's hard to build a natural monopoly. So in Web2, you're building monopolies. So you're encouraging zero-sum thinking. But in Web3, you can't, because everything's permissionless. And you see this also with other companies. We're not the only large company or largest company that is making investments. You look at Coinbase, you look at Binance, you look at OKX. Like, they're all making investments as well. Maybe there's many or more or less, but it doesn't matter. They're all actively seed investing and encouraging young entrepreneurs. But in Web2, Microsoft doesn't do this. Facebook doesn't do this. Google doesn't do this. They may have a ventures team, but they do not invest in young startups and try to encourage their growth, right? So yeah, that's just part of that shaping and thinking. And maybe just to close this thought, we also think that gives you a competitive edge. Because do you want to do business with someone where the value they generate is purely extractive? Or would you rather do business with someone knowing that when this business does well, it actually helps and furthers the ecosystem that you're developing, that you're in, and will grow it? Because with every investment that we're making that comes from the profits that we may have generated from another investment, we're actually bringing new customers into the space, right? Every time we invest in a new concept or a new paradigm that onboards new people, they actually come into Web3, they might do something else, and they may potentially become your customer or influence someone else to become your customer, right? So this is actually a net positive, and it's kind of like a reinvestment in the ecosystem. But again, I don't view this necessarily as just like it's not CSO. Like, this isn't like a to be viewed as a sort of as a charity activity. It is still a activity that is meant to generate profit, and that is because it needs to be sustainable.
And yeah, I see a very strong value system that you have had across your upbringing, inspired, by a situation where you were growing up. You took the example of your mother. By the way, that gave me goosebumps when that became the inspiration for you to build something like this, right? But success and money has not changed you. And that culture I have noticed across Animoca brands. I have been lucky to speak with many of your team members, Alan, Evan, Lucius, Sam, shout out to all of them. Amazing people. And I see the same level of modesty and humbleness across your team. And this is why I specifically highlight this is crypto and blockchain has been made as synonymous with bling. And it is made to believe that to shine, you have to kind of show and create a lot of show. While building in the last 1.5 years, I also received so many of those advices and I've stayed away from those. And that's why I'm very keen to pick your brains on how do you do that? You worked hard, you built something, you got success, you got the money, but you're still stuck close to your values, to your tradition, to your ethos. And you've built a company at an organizational level also in the same way. How do you do that?
So I think it's kind of top-down in this case, right? Yes, you recruit people and bring people in that share your values and ethos, which, by the way, isn't always easy, especially when businesses grow and you have to just hire a lot of people. Sometimes people join you for different reasons. During the sort of in our era, I would say our biggest bull market was when NFTs were sort of rising the way that they were in late 21 and early 22. A lot of companies come to us and individuals who want to either work for us or partner with us, and the motives aren't necessarily clear, even if they say the right things. You can't really tell, which is why bear markets are so great. Because when you're hiring bear markets and you invest in bear markets, you kind of know who are the ones who are here for real purpose and have a real mission. our big success stories that we're known for really came around 2018 and 2019, like the sandboxes and Axie Infinity and OpenSea. Now you got to remember, in 2018 and 2019, Bitcoin was $3,000. Ethereum went below 100. Okay, like these were dark days. ICOs were basically killed the industry. It was all super scammy. And even if you uttered the word crypto to some person, it was like, okay, you're like, I don't really know. I don't. And the number of people that knew me from before, because I wasn't in crypto before, knowing that I'm in this field, even though it wasn't crypto or tokens per se, it was like NFTs and gaming. They're like, yeah, this is not you. Like, you shouldn't be doing this stuff, right? It feels like, like have you been taken over by the dark side, as it were? Those are common comments. But if you feel that your purpose and the impact you can create from that purpose is significant enough, then it doesn't really matter, right? Perhaps the most famous example of this is, we were listed a public company in Australia. That's our background. And we were given a choice in 2019, stay a public company on an Australian stock exchange or basically dump crypto. We chose to stay with crypto and we got delisted from the Australian Stock Exchange. So that kind of demonstrates the extent of our conviction of why we thought this was something worth sacrificing for. And just to be clear, normally when you get delisted from any stock exchange, it's the end of a business, right? It's not like you go to anyone and are given this choice. Typically speaking, people would say, wait a second, because your shares stop trading. It's like getting delisted from imagine getting delisted from a major exchange with a token. That would be like almost the end. Very, very often, right? So we had to basically make a decision. And to me, the sort of purpose drive is, what are the things that you're willing to do and fight for that are greater than your own? And I think this is the thing about where money is often something where we can test it with this sort of money test, right? Because if you feel like, you're here for money, then there's many other ways to make money, right? In one form or the other, right? But if you're here for a mission that is really, really important, and you may not have found a way to do it, but you'll keep at it because it's something that you're willing to sacrifice for, you're willing to have sleepless nights for, you're willing to basically, go to bat for, and even talk to people who, maybe you wouldn't want to talk to, but you'll still ask them for support and help because it's that important, where your ego is basically in check because what you're doing is so much more important than your ego. And that's basically, I think, if you can find founders like that, we love to back those kind of founders. But generally speaking, that's sort of how we think about stuff. Therefore, that thinking is something that other people will follow as well. And somehow, most of the time, not always, you generally hire people that have a similar belief because they follow you and work with you in that same way. Again, building culture is one of the hardest things in any organization. We're over 1,000 people. So managing that culture across the board is always a challenge. And you're right, the people, I think we have a very strong culture, but it can always use improvement. But generally speaking, I would say, that's sort of, if there's a North Star that you want to put forward to, and people know why they're here, then that's usually a good base for that.
Absolutely. And I'm sure when you take these difficult decisions, like whether delisting from an exchange or staying true to your value system, when the market is saying A and you say, no, we believe in B and we're going to do B, you face a lot of resistance internally as well when the company starts growing, and externally, of course, from the market. Is there any example, without naming anybody or any organization, that you would like to talk about where you face a lot of resistance, internally or externally, you still sailed through sticking to your value system, and I'm sure it was a longer journey, but eventually it paid off?
So generally speaking, I think it's a little bit of you're business builders, you probably know anyway, right? But it's generally a bit of a myth to think of decisions as pivotal all the time. Like in many cases, like we run, there are hundreds of decisions, big and small, that you end up making in a week in one form or the other, even if they're tiny, but sometimes just instinctively, where, you make a decision that you're sort of deciding on which way to go, generally on the basis of your values. So at least that's kind of our experience. Of course, you have to make a decision that makes sense which is another kind of value, right? As opposed to you make a decision where you're just gambling. I mean, it may seem very sort of, banal, but the way that you operate in life and the values do guide your decisions instinctively. And as you go on and build in them, certainly what I found is that it becomes easier and easier to make these decisions as you become clearer and clearer as to what your values are. So when young founders are building a business, they're often given information and told stuff about business, like business school. You go to business school, they generally, especially the older forms of business school, would tell you about leave no quarter, basically, take everything. If you leave a little bit behind, you've kind of lost. There's very much zero-sum thinking, right? Which, by the way, I think is wrong. And I think it's wrong because as humans, we're not designed that way. I mean, if every single person in the world operated on the basis of zero-sum, take, in real life, we call those psychopaths. Right? You're not going to have friends with someone who takes everything away from you. You're not going to go and, just think about your social life. If you go to, maybe I have dinner and I pay for dinner, then you have dinner, you pay for dinner, or like there's some kind of social reciprocity. But if a person basically just freeloads from you all the time, or stays at your home and never pays for anything, or just, raids your, like people would simply just take, what do you do with them? Do you call them friends? Do you have them hang around? Like, I mean, right? So it's not just social decorum. The people who do this and don't feel any guilt or shame, these are people who are lacking empathy. So again, they're either psychopaths or sociopaths, the people who don't understand that level of appreciation. And unfortunately, these people do tend to be ones that sometimes can be charming, but more importantly, can be ruthless. And so they can appear effective, and maybe they're effective for certain tasks. But that's not how we constructed society. If everyone was like that, if everyone was just self-serving and basically only cared about themselves, I think society would have crumbled a long time ago. Right? And we see this when there's crises, when there's problems. Are we running away only to take care of ourselves, or do we reach a helping hand? And I think the stories, not just that inspire us, but that keep society and the fabric together, are those where we reach out. When things are tough and difficult, we come and help each other, save each other, support each other in one form or fashion, right? So that to me is sort of the natural state of thinking. And so we believe in that. We think that humans are inherently good and want to do good things. And so we build a value structure and we build sort of the culture around that thinking and believing in that, knowing that, of course, there might be some that take advantage and, okay, shucks, too bad. But that doesn't necessarily take away sort of our general, let's call it optimism, that broadly speaking, as a species, we want to progress forward in a positive manner, right? As opposed to taking the assumption that we're all here just out for ourselves, which is what some people believe, right? Some people think, and it's a viewpoint. And that's why I say it's kind of a philosophy of how you think you want to live life and how you want to sort of act on that. So this comes down to sort of some examples. And I mean, it's I won't name the names, but it's an example that I went through. This was a time in 2009. I was running a company called Outplays. It was one of the first cloud computing businesses in the world. Certainly probably one of the biggest ones in Asia, email, and we were selling the business to IBM. Big deal at the time, right? And very important for us because actually also if we didn't sell the business to IBM, we probably wouldn't have started Animoca Brands. Just because of the fact that when we eventually sold the business, we basically had to stop anything in enterprise. We had remnants of a gaming business over there, a small gaming business that we then basically moved into mobile, which basically was the initiation of Animoca, right? That's kind of the history and the context and the background. Anyway, there was a clause in the M&A agreement with IBM that required us to bring over a certain number of key employees in order to close the transaction. Very normal, right? Because it was really, it was an asset purchase, but it was also a talent purchase.
Yes.
And we're a very big open shop house. So, IBM was really keen into our knowledge on Linux and eventually became part of Lotus Notes. And a number of people who were key actually went and basically blackmailed us. And they said, hey, well, we know that you need, us, but if you don't pay us X amount, which is not just substantially more, but it's unrealistic. It was just like a crazy amount because everyone was giving a distribution of some sort. and we're talking about transferring something like 120 people, right? So it's sizable, right? Then we're just not going to do it, which means you get nothing. And, and literally it was a fuck you, right? And I will remember I was taken into the meeting room, had a chat with people that I had worked with for a long time, and basically having this meeting. And I'm like, oh, interesting, right? Now, of course, obviously I had to digest and think about it, because my calculus wasn't specifically about just what I would make, but it was about the fate of 100 or 120 other people as well, right? What would be the decision? And someone is blackmailing you as well. And so that to me is a perfect example of where values are the judgment for it, rather than necessarily pure business decisions. Of course, each to their own, right? Because maybe in order to so-called save the business, maybe I should have done a deal with them perhaps. But the way that decisions have to, in my mind, be the kind that you can sort of go to sleep with a clean conscience, and I sleep well, such that you can have a good night's rest, and you know that whatever decisions, they may not necessarily be the best decisions apparently, but if they're ones that you feel are in good conscience, I think ultimately they're always right, or certainly right for you, because you have to live with that, right? And I do believe in living a life where you don't do something that you did with intentional regret, as it were, right? Easier said than done, obviously. So I refused, right? I refused. I gave it some thought and I refused. But the decision making for the refusal was on the basis of, this is something that this isn't just, I'm not the one making the decision. You know what everyone's getting. Everyone's getting the fair deal. Everyone's getting proportionate to what they had agreed on, to the ratio, including myself, right? So this wasn't a case where I was, because, I wasn't like 90% shareholder or something, right? There was a distribution to shareholders, to staff, to employees that was pretty fair. And what you're really saying is you would like others to basically sacrifice other stuff for you to move on. And are you prepared to tell those people that you would do this? Like, in other words, it's not just about a business deal with me and you, it's about you having to basically tell everyone else in the community as well, your particular developer community, that you're basically holding them hostage. And if you're willing to blow it up, then can you live with that, right? And in my mind, this is where I, again, think about, maybe this was for their own reputations, but ultimately, of the 3 people who did the blackmail, 2 of them immediately sort of evaporated, right? Because they weren't really that comfortable, because ultimately they had good intentions, but they were dragged along by one person who was like the ringleader, but he needed them because he needed to create leverage, but they weren't really there. I took a gamble on what I thought that most people are good. And it could have gone wrong, right? It could have been the other side. But I would also argue that had I given this, regardless of, even if all 3 of them would have actually made true on their threat, I don't think I would have lived happily after that. I would have felt regret for having done a decision that was against my values. And it would have been something I would have felt was unfair, and probably would have affected me in different ways, that I may not have known, right? And I think that people come with all sorts of crises of this form, because when money is involved, you come to these decisions. And I think you have to stick to whatever value judgment you have around that.
Wow. And I can only assume how difficult it is to stand by those values every day, because I've seen it in my life. I started in the corporate world, did like 10 years in the corporate, then moved on, did my startups. Always took a decision what my heart told me that, okay, this is the purpose why I'm born, and I'll work hard to deliver this, even if it is difficult. And every time it has been a very complicated journey. But in the long run, when I look back today, 15 years of my life, I wouldn't change a thing. But living in the moment, taking those decisions at that particular moment, really drags all the energy out of you, because you are competing with the, so to say, norm. Everybody does things this way. You're doing it this way. So you always have to be in a constant fight with yourself as well as the world out there. But when you stick true to your values, in the longer run, it has always paid well.
I think it's like, to me, when we talk about struggles, it's the way I think of struggles is more like a sharpening, right? Every time you have a struggle, you really just sort of filtering and basically just honing that blade more and more, and you're testing it, right? Every time it's like, okay, how sharp is your blade really, right? And as you keep going at it, you basically realize whether the blade is truly as sharp as you think it is. Because there are moments in life where you start thinking, and some of those values that you thought were real values of yours will change, not because they aren't good or bad values, as it were, but because you're heavily affected by your environment, right? There's a sort of thing about sort of nature versus nurture. And there are certain aspects, I see this with my own children, that definitely you're born with certain attributes of who you really are and what you value. But because of your environment and because of family and because of society, you're nurtured into something. But maybe how you're nurtured into it isn't necessarily what you really believe in. Things like conformity, or, as an example, where you're taught to be a certain way. But then on the other hand, maybe you need to be a bit of a rebel. And for some people, that is important for them, and they're not able to act that out because, nurture told them not to, and they have a conflict. And I would say for myself, it's something of a journey that I had to go through building a business, going through all these experiences that helped me shape better understanding who I thought I was. And I would say it's still ongoing. I think it's never ending. It's kind of like literally the continuous sharpening of that blade.
Wow. Do you believe in fate, that everything is written, or do you believe that you create your own destiny?
I'm a free will kind of guy. So meaning that I believe very much that we have agency and we have decision, the ability to make our own decisions whenever we want to. And in fact, maybe there's certain things about our character and our being that influence us, right? But at the end of the day, we have agency over that position. You talk about quantum minds, right? Arguably, I think of ourselves, and I think why we as humans are special and different, not just specifically because we have a brain, biological, and fingers and that kind of stuff, but I think of ourselves as sort of chaos engines, right? Meaning that humans have this incredible quality that is both creative and heavily destructive. If we look at the history of humanity, we have the ability to create wonderful new inventions, and we have the ability to destroy in incredibly disastrous ways. That is something that is unique to us. There's no species in the world that has this kind of explosive, implosive capability, right? We constantly talk about how society might crumble and fall apart because of nuclear or this or whatever, all these reasons, because actually we as humans do have that capacity to completely annihilate ourselves on one hand, and yet create wonderful, amazing things. And to me, that's kind of like chaos, right? And that makes us unpredictable. And so I think of ourselves constantly in this, talking about quantum, in this sort of state of superposition where we really don't know where we are, okay? And then right at that moment, we make a decision, but based on our conscience and based on our values, we make a decision. And because, again, why I'm optimistic is we're broadly sort of want to do good things, right? We want to mostly live life having done good things and sort of being fulfilled, and helping others. And therefore, on balance, we will make decisions that are better for us, not something that will be utterly destructive, despite all the fears that people might have.
Wow. Where do you see yourself in the next 10 years? What's next for you?
So I don't plan my life in the sense that I say, hey, this is what I want. I know some people, might think of life a little bit more deterministically and say, this is my goal. I need to marry this life at this point. I need to have this kind of money and that kind of stuff. I don't think life works this way, and it hasn't worked for me this way. I kind of just took it where things come to me and I react to it. And of course I have planning, but I react to the environment, as it were, because life is inherently unpredictable. Change is the only thing that's a constant. So how can you plan for something? You can't do it this way. So I'm not going to sit here and say, well, in 10 years, I hope to this or that. I have a general sort of mission and purpose, but I don't have a specific that says, where I want to go. I would also say that I don't live life with any particular sort of, I sometimes get asked this question, if you go back in time, what would you change? I wouldn't change anything, because if I changed anything, then I probably would be different today.
Yeah.
And my assumption is that I can't make the decisions that I'm doing now and think about the world because I think I'm doing positive things. And maybe I could be doing bigger things, I don't know. But from my vantage point, I'm happy because I've lived life a certain way, and all these experiences help me shape the way that I am to deliver what it is. And I would argue that the next 10 years I will continue to be challenged. And I guess maybe as the business grows bigger and is more impactful, hopefully, and affects more people, we will become richer for the thought and ideas of it, meaning that we'll also have to hone and develop that as well, right? It's not just the journey doesn't stop here, right? It will continue to evolve and grow. And the other thing is, of course, because we generally know more about health and longevity, we are also going to live longer, which means that our impact and ideas are going to have longer effects than they had before. Because, in my parents' generation, I would be 10 years away from retirement, for instance. And now this idea of retiring seems impossible almost, right? And you would keep going. But I would certainly hope, as a general North Star, that the work that we do would actually remain not just as impactful as it is now, but actually much more impactful. Like, our goal is to bring billions of people into Web3, into digital property rights. That would be the goal, and that would be the North Star.
Wow. Thank you so much, Yat, for your time. I must say one thing. I always respected you as a builder. I had the highest respect for you as building something so good. Today, knowing you more, my respect for you has grown multiple.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for taking out the time. And I'm sure the listeners learned a lot today. This is going to be a big inspiration for them. I really appreciate you taking out the time and joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was Yat Siu. Thank you so much for joining Quantum Minds.